It's the 6th annual International Temple Mount Awareness Day. Another question that we've received, very popular question, is what's the deal with the red heifer? You know, back just a couple of months ago, we announced that we had a candidate for a kosher red heifer. It actually is located in, now I can tell you, in the state of Arkansas, the United States. It looked very, very promising. We made a short film clip about that, but unfortunately, before reaching the age of 1 year, that heifer began to sprout white hairs and therefore, according to Torah, became invalid. So, Jan asks, are there any updates on the red heifer? And for example, Rebecca asks, have you found a pure red heifer yet? And from Italy, a very good friend of ours asks a lot more specific questions about the shechita, the preparation, the slaughtering of the red heifer. Will it be carried out before or after the building of the Holy Temple? And will the Messiah, Mashiach, be present at the shechita? How is this all going to work? For those of our viewers that are maybe less informed about the whole concept of the red heifer, of course, we're referring to the ordinance of the Torah described in chapter 19 of the book of Numbers, the process of preparation of the ashes of the red heifer, which is an animal, it's a cow of a very particular red hue, of a very particular age, that can't have even 2 hairs of any other color, that can't possess any one of a variety of physical blemishes, that can never have been used for any sort of work. This process of the preparation of the ashes of the red heifer is exclusively the universal antidote to tumat met, to the type of impurity caused by exposure to death that is rampant according to Torah law in the world today. And the actual precondition for the building of the Holy Temple, and ostensibly what would appear to be the only thing that's really missing, it doesn't seem to be within our reach at the moment, are indeed the ashes of the red heifer. So that's what these questions are referring to, and indeed, the subject is very elusive. We know that there are many red heifers throughout the world right now. Many of them may potentially be able to satisfy these requirements, although ideally a perfect red heifer has to be separated at birth and raised under very, very specific circumstances with tremendous amount of guarding, and in order to prevent any of these blemishes from happening, it would really have to be in a kind of an isolated and protected environment under tight supervision. So how do we procure this red heifer? Are there any in Israel now? Are we going to have access to any? There is a tradition that all throughout history, this is actually in the chapter, in the tractate of the Mishnah, of the Talmud that deals with the laws of the red heifer, there's a tradition that all throughout history there were actually only 9 red heifers, and that the ashes of those animals were sufficient to provide the purity of all those subsequent generations from the time of Moshe, of Moses himself, until the end of the era of the Second Temple. And there is a comment made by one of our great sages, the Rambam, actually, Maimonides, that the 10th red heifer will be accomplished by the Messiah himself, which is actually alluded to by one of our questions here. So this is what I'd like to say about this for now, Yitzchak, and this is what we're going to call our update about the red heifer. The Temple Institute is about to embark upon a very comprehensive and intensive project relating to the final preparation of this whole subject, and relating to procuring ultimately the proper red heifer for the restoration of purity to Israel. And that will be the headline of this project. Just as we were able to produce that olive oil just a few months ago in purity for the first time since the destruction of the temple, and for the use of the illuminating the menorah, so too there is a movement to restore this concept of biblical purity, which really itself is the only stumbling block to the rebuilding of the temple on the level of of biblical law. In other words, once we are able to prove that it's possible under these circumstances to restore purity, then every excuse will really fall by the wayside. So we are going to be announcing in the coming months the beginning of a far-reaching, long-sighted goal of a project to provide the red heifer for Israel. So stay tuned, and we're going to be providing more information about that in the coming months. But it is something that we are ready for. It's something that we've been that's been a long time in the making, long time coming, and we are now beginning to prepare the infrastructure for the proper red heifer for Israel. This brings us to another question that many people are asking, and it's a pretty basic question. Sue put it this way: with the Temple Mount being controlled by Arabs, and we as Jews cannot even pray there, how can we build the temple? That's a very good question. Mark put it this way: why, for all that is holy, is prayer on Mount Moriah banned? Is it not true that the state of Israel has ownership of that land, with the Waqf authorities in peaceful arrangements regarding Jewish and other faiths' prayer rights? So that's a very good question. How is it that we are even dreaming about the rebuilding of the Holy Temple when, as Jews, by the way, the same thing is in effect for Christians, all non-Muslims cannot even move their lips in prayer on the Temple Mount? Yitzchak.
This all comes under the rubric here in Israel of what they call a status quo, which is some mythological level of reality which our politicians claim applies to the Temple Mount. Actually, in 1967, when the Israeli army liberated the Temple Mount, Jews began to inquire and wanted to pray there, and initially Jews were praying there, and the government, which sort of was didn't want a whole lot to do with the Temple Mount, was ambivalent. They stopped it, sort of on a one-off thing. They said, no, you can't use it in this particular occasion for prayer. And then that sort of evolved into the status quo, which our politicians have been citing, like a catechism for the past 45 years.
Almost as if it was a law. They say, no, only Muslims can pray.
There's actually nothing written down even. It doesn't exist. In 1994, Israel signed a peace treaty with Jordan, and in Article 8 of that peace treaty, and you can find it online, it says that both countries will work toward the respecting of all religious freedom of religion and worship on holy sites for all monotheistic religions. That's actually the wording of it. So according to the treaty that we signed with Jordan, obviously Jews and Gentiles should have complete freedom of worship on the Temple Mount. However, due to all sorts of labyrinthian Machiavellian political machinations some other kind of arrangement has evolved between Israel, Jordan, and the Waqf, which is controlled by Jordan. And the Waqf, originally, the idea when Israel gave over to the Waqf...
The Waqf is the Muslim trust that governs over the day-to-day administration of the Temple Mount.
When Israel gave over to the Waqf in 1967, custodial authority of the Temple Mount, it meant that they would remain in charge of those buildings in which Muslims worshipped. It had nothing to do with the Temple Mount itself. It had to do with keeping those structures under the edges of the Waqf so that Muslims wouldn't feel threatened that they're not going to no longer be allowed to pray there. However, over the years, the Muslims and Israeli government have both created this understanding that the Waqf is actually in charge of the entire Temple Mount. And that's where the problems begin, because the Waqf then says the entire Temple Mount is basically, in effect, a mosque, and no one is allowed to pray there except for Muslims. And this basically is the unfortunate
reality of the status quo. But let's recall that the State of Israel has repeatedly upheld, through the court system, including the Supreme Court, repeatedly upheld the right of all people to be able to pray at all holy sites. And specifically, it has been emphasized legally that the status quo is fictitious, that it has no grounds whatsoever, that all people must be able to pray, this is enshrined in democracy and basic civil liberties and human rights. Very recently, there was an unprecedented court case here in Jerusalem wherein the judge declared that the police have no right whatsoever to stop anyone from praying on the Temple Mount, and indeed they must protect the Jewish right to be able to pray there, and that any other statement or arrangement is completely illegal. But there still is a gap between that declaration and the facts on the ground because of the Machiavellian machinations and subterfuge that you refer to that's going on behind the scenes on a diplomatic level between governments having to do with things that are considered to be of far-reaching consequence. But again, what was the basic question that we were asked? How could we talk about rebuilding the temple when we can't even pray on the Temple Mount? Well, that's just it. The fact that there has been such an increase in Jewish visits in purity and according to Jewish law to the Temple Mount, and this fact that there is such an outcry over this ridiculous situation, the fact that even on the level of the Knesset there have been powerful voices that have been really just bringing this issue to the forefront, it's a tremendous diametric change in just the public awareness of this as an important issue, and it's really solidifying many levels of Israeli society. It's becoming a tremendous cause. And so actually, I think that the fact that this issue is so, it's becoming so well known, and there are such outspoken voices about it, and the pathos of it, and the absurdity of the situation is something that is being discussed in the halls of government. This is more than ever an indication that we are moving towards the rebuilding of the temple, because it's a situation that is untenable and cannot be accepted, and the people of Israel are beginning to make that statement collectively that they won't accept it, that they don't accept it. So there's a monster here with several heads, and we don't know who's on first. There's the police, there's the courts, there's the Prime Minister's office, and it's unclear maybe at times where these orders are coming from and why the situation is as it is. But one thing is for sure, and that is that the people of Israel are returning to the Temple Mount, returning, I mean, as a double entendre, also physically they're returning, but also in the understanding of teshuvah. They are making this teshuvah of repentance. They are returning in their hearts to the Temple Mount, meaning they're beginning to undo the historical wrong of the fact that generations have been raised being told that we have nothing to do with this place, that the temple is never land, that this is not a place for the Jewish people, and they're beginning to demand that this be rectified, because this is our place, this is the only holy place for the Jewish people. And the very fact that we're even discussing this now, and that we've made so much progress, and that it is in the courts, and that people are, making it into an important issue and paying the consequences sometimes for praying there, shows us that this movement towards temple consciousness, restoration of the temple and the building of the temple, which of course goes on the Temple Mount, and all roads lead to the Temple Mount, we are right on target, and the nation of Israel is healthy, that heart is beating, and the center of that heart of the people is the Temple Mount. You're watching the 6th Annual International Temple Mount Awareness Day.